So I'm going to start with my list in order here that I have, and I'm going to start with Steve. And what I'm going to ask each of the panelists is just to tell us briefly a little bit about how they got into EmComm originally, and maybe a little bit about themselves. So we'll start with you, Steve.
Okay. Well, my beginning was back in 1957 when I was called by a ham who was worked for the state of Tennessee to go to the VA hospital and operate the CWCD statewide network, emergency network, because the CW operator that usually did that was ill. That got me started. From there, I didn't think much about it through my youth. I got involved with AppLink, Aptor Packet Link in 1986, being mainly a CW operator up until that point. And I met a gentleman who had a methodology to provide digital messaging over amateur radio. And when Windows came along, that changed to WinLink. And then NetLink, when the internet came about, we added the internet. And the majority of the membership or the users were maritime community. And there was a pleasure sailing boats worldwide. And there are plenty of accidents. So we had a little medical team, and we had the mechanical team, etc., to assist the maritime community. And as the National Incident Management System came to fruition, WinLink dramatically changed from maritime community, or expanded from the maritime community into authorities having jurisdiction, and amateur radio operators, critical infrastructure people. They all started to adopt this as a resilient methodology when all else failed, literally. And it has grown from there, where now it's not only on amateur radio, it's on government services, and it's not only in the United States, it's on other government services in other governments worldwide, including things like the International Red Cross, etc. So that has been my interest as the administrator and co-founder of that product. I've had to be educated, and be actually involved. And it's addictive. I really enjoy every bit of it. The involvement with county, state, and federal agencies has been very rewarding, especially, when something happens and this service propels somebody to safety. So that's my background with this, with emergency services. I'm on several FEMA regional emergency communications working group committees. I chair the OXCOM committee for FEMA Region 4. I'm a team of COMU, Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. I'm the Shares WinLink administrator for CISA Shares, and Williamson County EMA Reserve. And that's my background.
Well, thank you, Steve. So we'll go from someone that I know that has plenty of years to someone that's a little bit newer in the game. So Diana, KJ7GVY, you want to tell us a little bit about your exposure to EmComm and your background?
Sure. Actually, my first exposure came back in the early 1979, 1980, when I was at Khao Dung refugee camp in Thailand, that's on the Thai-Cambodian border, during the Pol Pot conflict there. And the American Red Cross was in charge of communications. And it always seemed to work, but I never got to see any radios, but I knew that if we had any communication problems, they were the one to go to. So my actual experience these days got started about 5 years ago. I run a clinic on the Carson Indian Colony called the First American Regional Cancer Center. That's a private clinic. It's not part of Indian Health Service. And I joined the CERT team here. And the CERT team manager said he wanted all of the members, of which I was the only non-tribal member, to get some radio experience. And he said what that meant was at least get a tech license. So I took him seriously and I started studying. I've done a lot of study in the biological sciences, or some people would call the softer sciences, and in medicine, but I had never studied much about electronics and that kind of physics and that kind of thing. So I had a little bit of a learning curve with vocabulary, but it didn't take me long. And I found that preparing for the test was absolutely very interesting. The material related to a lot of the physiology that I had studied and did medical research on. And so after studying for my tech, while I was waiting to take the exam, I started studying for my general. And when I went to take my tech exam, I passed that, and they said, you want to take the general? So I passed that. But I hadn't started studying for my extra. So a few months later, when the next test came, I took the extra. And when people said, well, what area you think you're interested in? I said, I want to do emergency communication. So I had two good mentors, Greg Moore, KJ7D, I believe, and then David Thompson, AG7TX, and they really helped me out get started. One of our first events was going out into the wilderness, the eastern part of Nevada, and setting up dry camping for 4 days in the wilderness. And we had 3 different radio stations. Mine was one. I set up my tent. It was in mid-October, so pretty cold at night, got down to about 10 degrees. And the daytime high was all of 35 on the warmest day there. But because of my experience living out in northern Vermont, I was very well prepared and had a great time running my radio for 4 days in the middle of nowhere. That was very successful. And we also communicated with all of the other stations through a mesh network that we set up. So we were quite a team, and we actually won an award. We were doing contesting. So that was my first experience of running my radio in rural conditions where I didn't have any electricity, didn't have an internet. And that even made me feel like, I want to learn more. So I took EC001, which is the ARRL beginning course, and did all the exercises there, and got even more interested because those exercises allowed me to begin exploring what kind of emergency communication was happening here in Northwest Nevada, where I reside. And I found out there'd be a lot of room for me to actually help grow emergency communications here. And so that's what I spent my time doing. Looking at how come we weren't part of the national traffic system? How come we have to try to get down to Las Vegas in order to have a communication? How do we talk to Reno only 30 miles away, but over some mountainous ridges? And just asking a lot of questions. And then I became, I was asked to do to become a field instructor and to become one of the instructors for EC001. And I really enjoyed that, not because I have so much field experience like a lot of the other panelists here tonight, but because the experiences that I did have allowed me to ask questions and to come up with creative solutions and creative answers. And I really enjoy hearing different people's experiences, because it allows me to begin thinking, what would I do in those circumstances? So that only has propelled my creative ability. And I think right now that's one of my strongest points. I have a pretty good setup. I'm able to bring my radio station that's set up at the clinic into the field at a moment's notice and enjoy amateur radio. And I've got a lot of good support from Dan and some of our other RATPAC presenters tonight in helping me explore other aspects of amateur radio and emergency communication. So I really appreciate that.
Well, that's great, Diane, and I think you bring up a really good point for anyone that's involved in running EmComm in their area, and that is bringing in newcomers sometimes gets those questions asked that need asked, that sometimes aren't is evident to people that have been doing it for a long time. So bringing in a fresh look and asking questions can be a great thing. We're going to move next to the East Coast to Lem, W1LEM in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Anthony, and hello, everybody. I am on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and about 15 years ago, I was involved in the Cape and Islands Red Cross, which has since been subsumed into the Massachusetts Red Cross, and that's another story. But I was the disaster action team leader for one of the zones on Cape Cod. During that experience, I became acquainted with the gentleman who was our district emergency coordinator. I didn't know what a DEC was then because I wasn't a ham. But 6 years ago when I became a ham, first thing I did was call Frank, and we had lunch and talked about things. And he said, "You want to be involved in Aries?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, we're having an exercise in 2 weeks. Why don't you come?" And then with my 2-week-old license, he made me NCS for a tactical net for the exercise we were doing. So I got thrown in and learned stuff, and I've been active in Aries ever since. So that's my story. Recently, I've gotten involved in traffic handling as well, and I'm working with some things in the Eastern Massachusetts section.
Well, thank you, Lem. Next, we'll jump back out west to Dennis in California, W6DQ.
All right, Anthony, thank you. And boy, listening to Steve, there's some big shoes to fill following him. Like we are. Wow. Dennis, W6DQ. I started out as WN6NIA back in the late 60s, but I got introduced to ham radio in a disaster, which was the Alaska earthquake in 1964. My next door neighbor was a ham, W6QJU, named Bob Martin. And he introduced me to radio, and boy, I was hooked. And electronics and radio, I've never looked back. But my first experience with emergency communications came in 1971 when we had the Silmar earthquake in Southern California in the LA area. And I was in engineering school at the time, and I am a retired engineer, electrical engineer, system engineer, really and truly. The Silmar quake, when I was in college, a couple of friends of mine in the radio club at school were involved with the EmComm with the city of Los Angeles, in particular Los Angeles Police Department, and they invited me to come along on a venture out to the earthquake zone. We were living down in what's known as the South Bay, which is about 40 miles south of where the earthquake occurred. Sure felt it though; it was a big earthquake. So we got to assist the LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, as mobile units patrolling for looters and patrolling for curfew violations, and also running supplies out to the checkpoints that were set up around the city, San Fernando Valley. It was quite an experience for me. You know, I'd never done anything like that, and I was hooked on it. But it took me a while to really get geared up into EmComm. I traveled overseas, lived overseas in Hong Kong for 4.5 years working on a project over there. And when I got home, I got involved with the city of Long Beach, the amateur radio club in the city of Long Beach here in Southern California, Associated Radio Amateurs of Long Beach, and became a member of the Aries Races group there. and at the same time became a member of something called the Hospital Disaster Support Communications Group out of Orange County, California, and became an assistant emergency coordinator. And I had a technical role with that group as it was a large group. We had well in excess of 100 members in that Aries group. And we supported all of the receiving hospitals in Orange County, which number something like around 31 or 32 hospitals at the time. And as a technical coordinator, my responsibility was make sure that the equipment that we had at each hospital was functional. And the equipment we talk about were just antennas. Everybody provided their own equipment, but we provided the hospitals and with our help provided the antennas at each facility for their incident command posts. So that was an experience as an assistant coordinator. Spent many years, learned the tools of the trade, watched the evolution of what's now called HICS. That was an evolution of ICS, and really watched that evolve too at the same time. But HICS for the hospitals came out of ICS and was actually developed by the, I want to say he was the emergency medical manager for Orange County healthcare system, and that was Paul Russell. Was one of the instigators of HICS back in those days. So it was kind of an interesting thing to be part of that evolution and understanding that, and really seeing a really good group that really functioned well with the hospitals, and also liaised with the various RACES groups around Orange County, because they have a lot of city RACES groups in county. There's a county RACES group. So all of that interfacing with the other groups and Red Cross, just an amazing experience for me. So fast forward a few years, I retired and moved up here to the high desert in California. My wife and I live here, Lisa, KS6QNG. We live here in the community of Inyokern, located in a place called Indian Wells Valley. And you may be familiar with this area because about 3 years ago, we had a massive series of earthquakes here. The town of Ridgecrest and the town of Trona were hammered by a 6.4 and a 7.1 earthquake. We're right in the middle of it. Well, we had an Aries group here, but it was kind of makeshift, leaderless, not really a lot going, I didn't think there was a lot going on for it. So we kind of stepped up to the plate and tried to help out where we could with the group here. And we got kind of a rocky start, but that earthquake really crystallized everything. And I'm very grateful for a couple of folks over on the other side of the mountain here. And like Diana, we have a similar situation here. We're surrounded on 4 sides by mountains. And our county seat, and of course the county EOC, is on the other side of the Sierra Nevada mountains here. And like you say, about 30, well, it's actually probably about 40 or 50 miles to the west of us. Makes communications extremely difficult. During the earthquake, we really struggled with that. We had really no way to talk to the EOC directly, which was problematic. Well, the outcome of the earthquake, our Aries group supported our EOC here in the city of Ridgecrest. We provided them with communications. They were very concerned that they might have a building collapse or their radio tower collapse because of the earthquake. So we manned a mobile communication center and staffed that for them during the duration of the event here. At the end of that, I got in contact with somebody who's on here. I saw him on here a minute ago, is Dan Sohn, WL7COO, who is now our section emergency coordinator for the San Joaquin Valley section out here. And what Dan instrumented was creating a second Aries group here in Kern County. The mountain is just such a barrier. Mountains are such a barrier for us. We have an Eastern Kern County Aries group and a Western Kern County Aries group. And that got some of our issues sorted out in terms of organization. But I have to say, and I have to thank Steve, the introduction of WinLink to our group here has really changed the face of our EmComm here in Indian Wells Valley. I'm very grateful for having access to WinLink because it allows us to communicate via RMS gateways with our EOC in Bakersfield on the other side of the mountain range. And that's been a real boon. And we're going to be, we're actually having an exercise tomorrow. We're not going to physically demonstrate the system, but we're going to talk about it on a tabletop exercise with our fellow Aries members on the other side of the mountains over there. So this is going to be an interesting event. But I am the emergency coordinator, thanks to Dan, for the Eastern Kern County ARES. And we have, it's a small group. We have roughly 20 members, and but we are active, and we do participate regularly with the city and with the folks that emergency responders here, especially with our hospital, Ridgecrest Regional Hospital, and the Ridgecrest Police Department. We have a rather unique organization called the Emergency Services Committee, of which we are a member. And this brings together police, fire, hospital, ambulance services, Red Cross, Salvation Army, other volunteer organizations in the community, as well as other healthcare facilities in the community. We all get together once a month and discuss issues. And this was something that's been around for 20 to 30 years and was a big boon during our earthquakes here 3 years ago. So anyway, happy to be here, and hopefully we have a good panel tonight, good discussions.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And
Thanks, Anthony.
we're going to swing over to Dan now. We're going to let Dan talk about this a little bit from not just his perspective, but also the perspective of being a section manager.
I assume you're talking about this Dan here.
Yes, I am.
Well, I've been involved for years in everything, it seems. But the one thing, Idaho doesn't have any disasters, unfortunately. We did have a couple of earthquakes that woke us up, but we don't have the floods and the things that a lot of the other states, unfortunately, have to put up with. I was deployed by the American Red Cross to go down to the San Francisco earthquake in '89, I think it was. And I went down there to run a shelter. And while I was going through my initial physical, they had their amateur radio set up there for that area, right there in the room next to it. And people were calling them, and oh, it was going on and on and on, and no one was there. And when I got up to my turn to talk to the doc and all that, I says, you know, if you guys want, if there's more value to you, I can help run your station in here. But somebody else would have to take the shelter. And that's what happened. So I enjoyed that, a lot of experience. It was interesting. You know, I just make one phone call and they got out a Learjet in New York and send me all kinds of cell phones. In those days, cell phones were like bricks. But anyway, the power of a disaster and being a part of it. You can do a lot of good if you're properly trained and working with properly trained people. You can do a lot of bad if in the wrong situation. So I think in the wrong situation, those that know what they're doing will get rid of you in a hurry. But at any rate, I started RATPAC. We didn't call it RATPAC then, but I started RATPAC about 2.5 years ago, something like that. And it was for the ARRL and for the section managers. And what happened, I kept getting calls, I kept getting emails and such. It pushed me to do a similar thing for ARES, which later became just disaster communications. So I said, what the heck? So I did, open it up for ARES. And man, there's a huge, enormous amount of people out there starving for information, wanting to be involved. Very enjoyable. We started some chat groups and it grew quickly. I got to know some wonderful people. Some are still on the night. And I've learned a lot. People on here that share their experiences, guide the way. I've learned a lot, and that's helped me. Idaho is a problem state in a sense, we're sort of a maverick, if you will. We got a bunch of guys who call themselves ARES, but they'll often do their own thing. And we're slowly moving them around. So we're working as a team, but it's taken some doings. It's very aggravating as an SM in the states that have anything going on at all. And I do mean anything going on at all. It's a lot better opportunity for people to get something done in the ARES programs. But it's also very rewarding. That's rewarding when you see things working that maybe weren't working or working smoothly before. So it has its benefits. And with that, I'll throw it back to Anthony.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. We have one last person I want to bring up, and that's Roger, KD4JQJ.
Okay, I did not realize I was going to be on the panel. I told Steve I was just going to ask questions, but
Well, you can thank Steve for that.
absolutely, he's my buddy, man. I got involved back in about 1968 was my first exposure to ham radio, but then college got in the way, and I'd never got my license until after Hurricane Hugo, which hit South Carolina in 1989. I had a job here with a federal agency, and one of my responsibilities was post-hurricane recovery, and quickly decided to have an amateur radio into the toolbox was a very good thing to do. So I got my license. Once I retired from the federal agency, I got involved and recruited by the state. I got involved at the State Emergency Operations Center. And from there, we've been trying to build out our state resiliency system through a 3-channel, 2 analog and 1 digital statewide repeater system. It's called the SC HEART, South Carolina Healthcare Emergency Amateur Radio Team System. I'm also still involved with the state EOC. I'm involved with the implementation of our auxiliary communications program in the state, and serve on several state working committees. And so other than that, that's pretty much a quick summary.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. Now, I know I could actually bring in many more people on this group that could be part of our panel, but to keep it under control tonight, we're going to stick with these 6 people. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow anyone to ask questions. Now, there's 2 ways to ask questions. One is raise your hand, and I'll acknowledge you, unmute, and go ahead and ask your question. But also, to facilitate even more questions, please feel free to type questions into the chat also. And I will be happy to either direct them to one or more of the panel members. So if you have a question, either raise your hand or go ahead and type it into chat. And the panel members are also able to ask other panel members questions also. So they're not limited from just being a panel member. They can also be a questionee. So I think Michelle might have our first question that she wants to start off with. Well, actually, the question is for Dennis, and she asked, from an engineering perspective, what is the one technology most needed in emergency communication that we currently don't have or don't do well?
Wow, that's quite a question, Michelle.
See, that's what happens when you say you're a system engineer. You get up with a
Yeah,
question
you're
like
right.
this.
Well, she knows that. She knows I'm an engineer. We've known each other for a long time, and wow, one technology most needed in emergency communications. Well, obviously, the stuff that we do have, radio is probably the most important technology, and the communications is key to any disaster, any emergency, and we keep getting drilled that by our. I mentioned our ESC group. The fellow who runs the ESC is he actually is the emergency manager for the EOC, our Emergency Operations Center, but he also chairs the ESC meeting. And that's one of the things he always stresses. He always points to us as the hams in the group and says, you guys know how to communicate. And that's probably it, maybe not necessarily a technology, but it's the function of communications. And that's the role that we play. And not so much the technology, but the skills that we have as communicators. And we need to learn, how do I put this? Many groups do a really, really great job at communications, and my hat's off to that. Others do not. And communications is key, so that the technology, it's not a technology, but it's more of a function of communication that I think a lot of hams could do a better job at, and not necessarily hams that are directly involved in EmComm. If they're active in EmComm, they're usually pretty well trained and understand procedures and processes and what have you. But there's a huge group of hams out there that are not involved in it, but they're a great resource, but they need to know how to communicate with us. So that's probably one thing that I would note, not a technology, but I don't know.
Well, our next question is
That's a
from,
great question though, Michelle. I'm gonna have to go
well, let's just think about it some more. If you have more, you want to come
Yeah.
back to us, that'd be fine.
Come back to
Our
that.
next question is from George K0GCP, and he says, in the Twin Cities we have a hospital comm, but several hospitals have chosen not to participate. Any suggestions on how to get the hospital managers interested? And I'll throw that out there for any of the committee members that would like to speak up. The panel members, I should say, not committee.
Help. My suggestion would be to get those hospitals that are involved to invite those that are not in whatever function occurs on a continual basis or regular basis, because that is your peer group. And those hospitals that are involved, you may want to help them by suggesting some of the benefits that you provide that hospital or those hospitals. That would be the way I would go about it. Not
Steve, I
knowing
think
any
that's
more than I do.
Steve, I think that's an excellent idea and a reminder that, you know, it's much easier for these peer groups to talk to each other sometimes than for us to talk to them. So by leveraging them can be a very invaluable way to go about doing that. Anyone else want to? I think Dennis has something on the hospital question.
Yeah, I have something I can add to that. I think I don't know what your situation is in the Twin Cities, but in Orange County, you have a central, like most large cities, most counties have a central group that oversees the hospital, MOHOC, right? Your operational area coordinator for medical and health. And having a good relationship with that group, those people who are in charge, you know, that really are depending on the hams to communicate with those hospitals if there is a communications interruption. And that's really the role. One of the roles of the hams in a hospital environment is communicating with your EOC and your MOHOC, but as well as communicating internally if there's an internal disaster, internal phones out. But that external communications is vital for the hospital to be able to communicate with their MOHOC. And if that hospital is not participating, that's problematic for both your city, the MOHOC, and other hospitals in the area. I'll give you an example. If you know, with our 30 receiving hospitals in Orange County, and our our EOC, which we call Control One, was where the coordination took place for all those hospitals. If communications was down and there was a large disaster, the EOC is responsible for dispatching ambulances and things like that during the disaster. If there's no communications with the hospital, they have no way of knowing what the hospital is, what their status is. Can they receive patients? Can they receive any patients? Are they even functional? Are they code black? You just don't know. So that's where the ham radio part comes in at a citywide or a countywide situation with hospitals. So yeah, like Steve says, peer pressure would be great, but I think pressure from your central, whatever it would be, your healthcare organization that really manages the hospitals in your area, those would be the guys to be involved with. And the hams there ought to be involved with that group because that's key to making those hospitals function. So
thanks, Dennis and Steve.
Yeah.
A question from Jim talking about burnout. I have been involved in communications. This is Jim W2KF Victor. I've been involved in emergency communications for many years. I found that the average volunteer lasts about 5 years here in the New York, Long Island area. Would you agree? Any of our panel members like to speak to that? Maybe give some of their experiences with the burnout situation.
Well, I can tell you what we've done in South Carolina.
Yes.
We've had, and it depends. A lot of different counties, they go through people very fast. 5 years may be a long term for commitments from the volunteers at some of the counties. At the state level, we've had the core people. I've been involved now for 15 years with them. And other than a couple of people aged out as far as they got to the point they physically couldn't volunteer and come to the facility, it's been pretty much the same core group. And we keep trying to recruit new people. I think the key to it is the involvement and the relationships you build with the agencies you're serving, if they see you as a big benefit, they do things to make you feel like you're part of the express team. And generally the people, if they feel good about what they're doing and they're having opportunities to do things throughout the year, they all stay pretty much involved. That's just our experience in South Carolina.
Roger, you might want to mention about SC Hart. That's really impressive. At least it used to be. I guess it still is.
Well, I mean, the SC Hart was a network that we built with a repeater system, which rides on the backbone of the state microwave system. And most of the sites are located at the educational television stations around the state. And it's a program that gets both funding and a little bit of, we do outreach for training, and all that's sort of funded and held together by volunteers in a state agency. And we have weekly telecons, and again, we have a statewide, there's probably about 30 to 50 people check in every Thursday, check out their radios. Some of them are at the hospitals and some of them not. And a good majority of those are been around since 2009 or still checking in every day. So again, it's a way to try to keep their involvement. And then during, of course, we have a lot of emergencies here. We'll have sometimes 2 and 3 hurricanes a year, plus an ice storm and an occasional tornado. And so people get really activated during real events. And I think that stimulates a lot more activity. Over.
Yes, and Dan said that there's not many emergencies in Idaho. Well, there's even less in Ohio. So we face one of the issues that burnout sometimes occurs because someone can be very involved for a number of years and not really be involved in an actual emergency. So it's a matter of continuous training, but not really that frequent of emergencies, which is a good thing, but it can be problematic for retention, and especially for retention of people that are up to date on things. There was a question from Victor about the political components. Some are compatible with ICS and want changes and won't get them, so they leave. So he's asking, how do you deal with personality conflicts within an emergency management system? And any of the panelists would like to answer that?
What was that again? I missed that.
Victor was asking about personality conflicts. How do you deal with those when you get people that are part of the group that don't feel that they're part of the change? The changes aren't being made in ways that they want.
What changes?
If I may interject here, that's not really a question, that's an observation.
Okay.
Of why people will not stick around. The quick example is the question of CERT. And CERT people were given the color green, and one person was arguing, well, green is for the command and control. And command and control said, no, the only person that's in charge is the one with the light. The color of your shirt does not matter. That was a personality conflict that separated people, divided people. That's just my observation.
Okay, if we could stick to questions, that would be helpful. If the authorities, this is from Elizabeth, if the authorities declare a climate emergency, which could last forever, who will be activated, and how would we be expected to volunteer at no cost cleaning up after profiteers with large environmental impacts? And that's a rather loaded question there, Elizabeth, but I'll see if anyone on the panel would like to jump on that one.
I don't quite understand what she means, but all disasters are handled through the National Emergency, excuse me, National NIMS, National excuse me. Can you tell them what I'm trying to say? I'm choking up here. National Information Management Agency through the Incident Command System. And that process is really the only process I've ever seen where various levels of government and their critical infrastructure non-government organization partners get along without conflict because the process is already predetermined and everybody knows what they're to do. So the answer to your question is it depends on what you mean by climate change disaster. It depends on what type of emergency you're dealing with, but all of that is handled through the National Incident Management System process. And the way you get involved in that, and the only way you can get involved in that, no matter how great a communicator you are, or how good your club is, or no matter how many trailers they have, or communication vehicles, or experts in this, that, and the other thing, is to be a part of a volunteer resource for one of these authorities that have jurisdiction. And the way you do that is by, it depends on where we're talking about and what it is, but the way you do that is by asking and becoming involved with organizations that perhaps already have. I don't know where are you in California, Elizabeth?
You can go ahead and unmute there, Elizabeth, if you'd like to let us know where part of California you're in, or type in the chat. Either way is fine. She's in the southern part of the state.
Well, okay. So there's somebody on here who you might want to talk to. He's got an 8 call, but he's not. He's in San Diego, and I think he may not be, but he still could be a section manager. I think he's still on here. Well, I thought I saw him in here. Maybe he's gone.
No, he's there. How about David N8KBC, right? He's there. Yeah, he's there.
I can't see, but anyway, yeah, there's somebody on here, David KBC, who is involved in the San Diego area. I don't know if that's where you are, but if you're not, he would know where else you could get involved, at least through the ARL or the OXCOM community. So what I would do if I were really interested in this is get online and take the 4 FEMA courses that everybody requires: 100, ICS 100, 200, 800, 700, and then go knock on some doors and see if you can't help with some of these organizations. The sheriff's office in LA has a very good organization. The Aries organization, there's about 5 or 6 of them in LA County that are really good. Some of them dealing with specific items like hospitals. There's the state, which has a legislated mandated program where you can become a volunteer resource for California Office of Emergency Services, but I don't know that much about it, and I'm here in Tennessee. So David could probably enlighten you if you're really interested, or you could email me and I'll turn you on to the state if you're interested at that level.
Thank you. And again, if you have any questions you'd like to ask them in person, just raise your hand. We'd be happy to do that. You do not need to type, so type in chat I don't want to stop you from doing that. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'd be happy to acknowledge you. And you can either raise your Zoom hand or your real hand, either one I'll try and acknowledge. Yes, Dennis, go ahead.
Well, Steve's right in what his comments were there, but I'm not sure that that's what Elizabeth was asking. If I read that correctly, and I think you nailed it, it's kind of a contentious topic, but I think you have to ask yourself, and I think all of us that are here as Aries volunteers, why do we volunteer? That's the whole thing, and it has nothing to do with what you're talking about, profiteers and large environmental impact. It has to do with the fact that we feel the need to volunteer and provide our service. It's part of why amateur radio exists. It's part of the basis and purpose of amateur radio is disaster communications and helping the public. So not just in disasters, but public service events, all of that stuff. So Yeah, I don't think, to me, I mean, that's the whole reason that we do this stuff, is because we are volunteers and we do it for the good of the community, and we do it for the good of amateur radio, and promoting amateur radio and prolonging amateur radio. Because if we don't do these things, the government could just as easily take our spectrum away from us, which they have done repeatedly in the past. So that's the way I would look at that.
Involved with more than one spectrum.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Play musical chairs with spectrum. Elizabeth, if you want to get on here and explain to us exactly what you meant, maybe we could hone in on that question and provide an answer that would benefit everybody.
Yes, and Diana had her question hand up there. Did you want to respond, Diana?
Yeah, I did. And I wanted to say kind of a combination of both what Steve and Dennis said at the individual level. Building those relationships with other people is one of the things that you'll have the opportunity to do. So not only will you get to build relationships with people at whatever level you're interested in connecting, whether it's federal, state, county, or your local city, or in organizations, but you'll also have the opportunity to do what Dennis said, and that is, yes, it will help amateur radio, but it's the relationships and building those relationships that will allow things to continue. You know, not just on a theoretical, oh, we're going to, make sure we have spectrum, but you're going to be integrating those opportunity for spectrum to remain in the amateur radio realm into all the different levels that you're interested in participating in.
And frankly, if you're a valuable volunteer resource, and Roger can attest to this, because Roger runs the state ESF2 monthly or bi-monthly meeting for the entire state of South Carolina. He's being very modest. I thought he would brag a little bit, but he never does. Anyway, there are more spectrums available that they will provide to you than the amateur radio spectrum. They're liable to hand you a P25, Motorola P25 statewide public safety LMR, land mobile radio handheld. They're liable to hand you a mobile radio that you can use that is off the ham bands and on their public safety frequencies, because when and if you become seriously involved, you need to be a part of that incident command system, and it doesn't use amateur radio. It uses a special group of frequencies that are set aside by the government.
One moment.
Oops, my phone's talking to me. By the government for that very purpose, to integrate and make interoperable all people that are involved in an incident. So, and Diana is 100% right. It's all about relationships. That's it.
Other questions, please raise your hand, put something in the chat, let me know. I'd be happy to acknowledge you and have you ask questions in person.
Anthony, there was a question in the chat that I was looking at here, and I'm trying to find the answer for it. And I'm very familiar with this, but I'm not sure I can quote it exactly. But let's see, where is it? It was Steve, KI0KY in Colorado, is asking about Joint Commission requirements. And I can tell you that the group I worked with in Orange County, our emergency coordinator, April Mull, WA6OPS, she was instrumental in getting amateur radio recognized as a bona fide backup communications path for healthcare organizations. In other words, that's how it became part of the Joint Commission requirements. And I was just looking through their documentation, trying to find it, and I could probably track it down. But it essentially what it says is that you have to have, you are required to meet the JC requirements. You have to have some form of backup communications. And it states, and if I can't remember the exact wording, but it does to the effect say that amateur radio is an acceptable form of backup communications for the healthcare organizations. So that's a great question. If I can find the actual statement, I will share that. I'm still trying to find it in the documentation. It is spelled out.
Okay.
And I was going to actually comment on something that Steve said. We were talking about earlier with the idea of getting hospitals involved in amateur radio that are not involved. He made a comment about WinLink Express, which is great. You know, the hospitals use something called ReadyNet, which is basically a statusing system back to their central healthcare organization. And that relies these days on the internet. So if you don't have the internet, you don't have ReadyNet. Basically, it's a status screen that's sent back to your central organization. In the
So
early
Dennis, we have a couple people quoting the Federal Register information. I think Diana has her hand up ready. She's got the page looked up and everything, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, I was looking for that and I couldn't find it. That's cool.
Go ahead, Diana.
Yeah.
I don't have the page looked up, but I can tell you how to find it. So if you Google the CMS requirements for California for 2017, they actually in their document have a footnote and quote and give you the history behind it in the footnote. And actually what they said as well is that hospitals that don't have that backup, including amateur radio as a part of that, that they may have their funds withheld from the CMS. So a lot of hospitals then in California started taking notice of that, and Joint Commission jumped right on top of that. CMS is the National Medicare yeah, so they give them, you know, the national insurance. So everybody's jumping on the boat together.
Well, I can speak
Medicare and Medicaid, I'm sorry.
Okay, very
sorry.
good. Well, thank you. Again, I can speak to Joint Commission because I did work in a hospital for years before I was even involved with amateur radio. And, you know, it really, those type of regulations, things like the Joint Commission really influence hospitals very greatly. I mean, they need to cross all the T's and dot all the I's for those Joint Commission things. So when it's a matter of a certification or commission approval, it really carries a lot of weight. Other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand or put it in chat. I'd be happy to acknowledge you and have you ask your question in person so you don't have to listen to me read all these. So while we're waiting for someone to ask a question, I'm going to ask the panelists to tell us about one of the situations where they got into an emergency communication situation that didn't turn out the way they thought it was going to be. So we'll give you an opportunity for anyone out there that's one of the panelists. Can you tell us about a situation that was not what you thought it was going to be? Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I did a talk about that here a couple months ago. If you recall, we had the talk was called "This Is Not a Drill," and we were expecting a large Orange County-wide exercise drill with hospitals, police, fire, sheriff's department, ambulance companies, Red Cross, all of these organizations involved. And the scenario was a terrorist attack in downtown Brea, California. And before we started the drill, everybody's getting in place to start the drill. And over the radio comes an announcement that our person who was on the drill site says, stand by, telling us to stand by, that something's going on. And the next thing we know, this is not a drill. This is not a drill. We have a real MCI, a real mass casualty incident. And I'm sitting at a Jack in the Box drive-through getting my breakfast. And I'm listening to local radio station KNX, and they're talking about this train wreck. I'm listening to that on the radio, and I'm putting two together, and I'm going, uh-oh, we've just had a train wreck. And turns out it was the largest mass casualty incident ever in Orange County's history, over 300, well, nearly 300 victims, several fatalities, and a lot of serious injuries. But we went straight from being a drill to being an actual incident. So that was not what we expected that day to hold for us. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think that does. Other questions? Again, we need questions from our viewing audience this evening. Please feel free to ask questions. You don't want me to ask more questions, so you need to ask questions. Please feel free to raise your hand. I'll be happy to acknowledge you, or you can type it in the chat. From Michelle, we got a question. What's the one thing that the FCC could do to help emergency communications? And I think we're going to get an answer from almost all of our panelists in this case. So go ahead and start with you, Steve. I see you're ready to jump on this one.
Well, first of all, the FCC last year stated that although, and they used the wording in 97 Part 1, amateur radio is involved with emergency communications. Amateur radio is not a emergency communications service. And there are political reasons why they made that statement, but we'll leave that alone. I think that there are things like in Part 97.113 where you are not allowed, look it up, 97.113, you are not allowed to use amateur radio on a concurrent basis without first attempting a commercial radio service. That was prior to cell phones, routers, wireless routers, satellite, or anything else other than CW and AM ship-to-shore services. That rule still exists. So does the rule that you cannot obstruct data, which takes a lot of the, because of code annotated in a lot of states, it takes a lot of the states, including your state, out of the picture because they're not allowed to put intra and interagency communication over a public network, which amateur radio is. Body counts, inoculation inventory, patient information, bedding inventory, anything you can imagine. You're not allowed to do that over amateur radio. Some states, I think South Carolina might be one, I know North Carolina is, it's a criminal liability if an agency does that. They're not allowed, the only information that can come to the press or to amateur radio operators or anybody else comes out of the PIO officially. That's where the information comes from. So there are a ton. There's the symbol rate rule, which retards digital communication totally. And that rule is being attacked right now, and I don't think it'll last, but currently it's still there, where they have a 300 baud symbol rate, not speed, symbol rate limit, a limit on the master-slave relationship in data protocols. Those are a few minor restrictions that are imposed on amateur radio, including having harmonically related frequencies, which all of us know in field day can be a pain in the you-know-where when you have more than one station in operation, where you're on 40 and then 80 and 20 and you've got harmonics all over the place. So, and another thing is that in bridging interoperability frequencies, you cannot bridge amateur radio with public safety Part 90 frequencies. So there are a lot of issues where you cannot use amateur radio equipment on Part 90 or FCC public safety frequencies, which has nothing to do with anything other, in my opinion, other than lobbying, where they can charge a ton of money for certain manufacturers to to provide equipment that is no better specification than other equipment. That could begin this conversation.
Any of the other panelists like to jump in on that?
Yeah, Steve, I'm surprised you didn't say something about one of the topics we've been talking about with WinLink, regularly on the committee about spectrum and having.
Oh yeah, well, the spectrum is all chopped up.
Well,
the United States is the only country that chops up spectrum to the extent that we've got over 400 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 2.4 kilohertz signals, 24 times 7, passively scanning on a 5 kilohertz spectrum. So yeah, there is, but that is something that the FCC, I know, wants to get rid of. They would like the amateur radio community to regulate itself, but that is that's going to take some. The FCC, the ARL proposed. I was on a band planning committee for the ARL back before Kay Craigie. He was a salesman in Dallas. I can't remember the guy's name. Haney. I can't remember his first name. He was the chairman of the board on the ARL, and they wanted to band plan by bandwidth. And that band plan by bandwidth was what every country in the world, including Canada and Mexico and every other country, does that. And they, if it's 2.4 kilohertz, it doesn't matter what mode it is, that it belongs in over here. And if it's 500 kilohertz or 200 kilohertz, it belongs over there. And the ARL put that band plan out, and they got so much opposition from their membership that they withdrew it. So we've got a long way to go, because there are a lot more interest in amateur radio than emergency communication, although that's the only reason why we're still here. And that's not my opinion.
Anyone else like to talk on that?
Michelle, you there?
She's chatting only, I think, right now. Any other questions? We'd be happy to take questions. I know that we're at 5 minutes after the hour, but we have time, so we're more than welcome to still take more questions.
Anthony, that whole thing about the question about what the FCC could do to help emergency communications, that kind of goes back to Michelle's original question she had about the technology. And I think that all kind of dovetails together, the topic that we've been talking about with bandwidth and symbol rates and all of that. And I know why, I realize now why Michelle's asking that question, because she might have some leverage there. But
you got to remember that the huge manufacturers of commercial radio equipment and the common carriers that provide that equipment are opposed to anything that would interfere with their revenue stream or the people that they services revenue stream, and they're going to vigorously oppose this. WinLink has been vigorously opposed by people through a foundation in a New York university. I mean, they find ways to do that are indirect. They pay a lot of money to lobbyists, and Michelle could just get in there and make it happen.
I think the general ham public, the general hams do not realize some of the things that you're talking about, Steve and Dennis. for one thing, I know with the way that the allocations are done in the United States is very foreign to other countries. I did a talk for a UK group recently, and they were just surprised by the way we go about our licensing structure. They couldn't imagine the fact that our beginning license doesn't have access to all the bands. They just didn't think, or modes. You know, they reduced the power. That's what their restriction is. They didn't understand this whole idea of why wouldn't you give people an opportunity to try out all the bands. And also when you're talking about a lot of the modes that we do with software in some cases for free, there's companies that can charge a large amount of money for hardware and or software licensing that would go away if we were able to replace those services with free services. So there is a conflict of interest in that respect.
That's right.
Other questions?
Oh, well, I might add one last thing about that. We do have, and Roger's in a state that participated, many states that value amateur radio and have written the chairwoman of the FCC expressing their desire to dispose of some of these archaic rules. Water on a duck's back.
Well, Michelle was saying that she was thinking about the symbol rate rule.
Right. Well, yeah, I mentioned that as one item, but the symbol rate rule is just one example, providing enough bandwidth. The FCC, another bureau in the FCC, if you remember Kurt Bartholomew, the Public Safety and Homeland Security, has recommended internally that they provide 2 or 3 frequencies on each amateur radio band that are exclusively set aside for emergency service calling and tactical operation. Because, you know, on field day and contest day and what have you, there's no way that you could use amateur radio to accomplish much on these days where the band is just rampant and QRM is part of the game. So getting around that with the old RACES program, getting around that and providing specific frequencies on each band that would only be allowed for emergency service purposes or exercise approved by some authority would also be another avenue toward providing assurance that communication could take place anytime there's propagation.
And I know one thing we've discussed in the past, a couple of the sessions and a couple of committee meetings, is not only the wide area activation during an emergency because of people knowing it, but also the activation of local area groups to know that there is an emergency situation taking place and that there's not a really good means of doing either of these two. And having those tactical channels to do that would be a very big step in that direction.
Yeah, I think what's the future is dependent upon how we all build these relationships and become a integral part of, like Roger's state, we become an integral part of the state operation and their ability to perform. Roger's group does things that alleviate the state having to do them and employees having to do them, so employees can do things that volunteers can't do. That's very important to know. Roger's group, I'm just making this up. Roger's group could keep keep diesel fuel in the tower generators and the emergency equipment. He could keep the batteries in the cash radios charged. He could help program the radios where there's no union and assist with those processes, hand out cash radios during exercises or real life events. There's a lot of things that volunteers can do that can assist and alleviate the budget of the authority having jurisdiction. That makes sense, Roger?
You are correct. The volunteers in the OXCOM program are treated just like any other state ComU person when they're activated, and they're just part of the team, and whatever needs to be done, they have a team assignment and the team goes out and does it.
Of course, you got 6 million people in your state. California has 6 million people on Los Angeles Beach at midnight. So it's a different animal, but it's just chunks of the same thing. And so all of that, when all that comes to fruition, and we all perform and do the job, and it's recognized, and we grow because of that, that's what's going to make the change. Public sentiment, and the fact that all these organizations like NEMA, National Emergency Management Agency, APCO, and the SafeCom National Council of Statewide Interoperability Coordinators, when they start endorsing all this and complaining because there's not enough of it, that's when things will start changing, I believe, if that ever happens.
I see Victor's got his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I can appreciate dedicated channels and dedicated frequencies for EmComm. I think that makes perfect sense. Where I get a little bit concerned is when you start thinking about repeater operations. A lot of places, the repeater bands or frequencies are in short supply anyway. Who's going to pay for the repeater? Again, if this is amateur radio, we're expected to pay for $3,500, $5,000 worth of equipment, and we may not get a mountain job to place them.
Let me answer that. Roger has a 23 node DMR linked network that does not use the internet but uses microwave. How much money did that cost you personally, Roger?
Nothing.
How much money did that cost the hams?
Nothing.
Who paid for it?
We were able to use grant money from Homeland Security through our state and local law enforcement division and install it on the state property.
And the reason why that happened is because it works. And that's chump change for what they get out of that. The resources that they obtain, that's chump change. So I hope that answers your question, sir.
It does, but now I have to repeat the question because I wasn't typing my note. My notepad out, folks. Come on, come on.
Do you know who Scott Dakers is? Scott Dakers.
DAKERS?
Yes, he's the man you need to talk to in the state of Washington.
And but yeah, okay. What the heck? Oh, I see what's going on, folks.
What county are you in? You in Seattle area?
I'm in Snohomish. Work with Scott.
I can't even spell that to look it up on a map.
Yeah, SNOHOMISH. It's native. All right, now you said it was a 23 node.
DMR, microwave link network in the state of South Carolina.
And we also have a 30 node analog network that rides on the microwave background too. And so it's really two separate networks. And that network was supplied by not Homeland Security, but Health and Human Services, because it supports the hospitals. But again, the key is building a relationship with served agencies and come up with the amateur community on how we can help, and then ask them to help fund and put in the system you need to do the work. And then when there's a real emergency or an event, show up and use the system and do whatever is they need to be done. And you get a lot of good support.
All right, thank you. And I did come up with the name. My Snohomish County manager is Scott Honecker.
Okay, well, Scott Honecker is a great guy,
Yeah.
and he has all of that.
In his
He
head.
has it all. He knows exactly what to do. He's a shares he's a shares member.
Yeah.
So he doesn't really need amateur radio, but he wants amateur radio volunteer resources. So knock on his door. He's great.
Talk to him every month. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Sure.
your guidance.
Well, Dan, I'm gonna call things off if we don't have any other questions immediately for our panel. We've went a little bit past our usual time, but I will give one last call for questions before we close down for this evening. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, open your microphone, put it in the chat any way you have so we don't miss you. But if you do have a question you'd like to ask before we close this down, please ask now. Seeing nothing, I'm going to turn it back to you, Dan.
Okay, Anthony, and thank you very much. Great job of emceeing. You got the knack, sir. Okay, thank you, everybody, and all the people who's on the panel. Appreciate your participation, all of you. At this, I'm going to shut her down, say 73s, and see you all next go around.
Thank you.